Hi, I'm Yvonne Maximchuk. I'm a writer and artist. I live on the BC coast, due east from Port McNeill on Guilford Island in the Broughton Archipelago. It's a place full of islets and inlets. It's a off-grid home. I've lived in this wilderness for 36 years. Moved here, 1986. It's a pioneer's life still, which I've always been drawn to. My husband and I cleared our property and milled the wood with our neighbor and built our home. It's still a work in progress. I thought I was coming to the middle of nowhere when I moved here, and actually, the world comes to Echo Bay. So it's been lovely to find a lot of new friends, a global market, and and a wilderness to run around in my boat and discover. When I was a kid, I actually remember vividly when I first time I ever pieced a word together, and the word was ocean, and it was coupled with a book with drawings in a kid's book. And I was looking at this baby whale drawing and reading about where it lived, and it lived in the Okeen. And finally, it came to me in a flash that the word, which I had heard, must be ocean. And I've always loved the combination of drawing and words. So I can't actually say when I first began to write or to draw because they were quite simultaneous. But I first wrote professionally. I wrote an article about Echo Bay for Harrowsmith magazine, and that got published. It was unsolicited. I had no idea about the proper procedures for submitting articles, but I thought it was kind of cool where I lived. And I had a neighbor, an old guy that had dropped his dentures over the side of the float, and he couldn't find a diver to fish him up. And so he nailed a can to a stick, and at low tide he got his dentures. And I just thought that was so funny and so resourceful, and I included that in my story about what it was like living in the wilderness and having a boat and running around in my boat and drawing and painting. And so it was a natural segue, I think. And yeah, Harrowsmith published that article, and they paid me $500, which is quite motivating. And then the year that that happened, in 1992, I was fishing with my neighbor, and I went to Haida Gwaii, which I had always wanted to go to. And we were using a book by Kathleen Dalzell to work our way around Haida Gwaii, and it wrote about good, safe anchorages and First Nations middens and relics and wildlife and stories. And Billy said, Bill Proctor, I could do that. And I'm like, yeah, of course you could. So we started on his book, but I quickly discovered that he actually had had no formal education. And so I began to teach him how to write. And it was wonderful because I had learned everything I knew and pretty much know from Bill about the world that he knew. And so it was lovely for me to be able to reciprocate and have something to offer him. So the book that we worked on, yeah, turned into a book called Full Moon Flood Tide. So that was co-authored by Bill and I, and was my first book, published book. So Bill and I worked on Full Moon Flood Tide for 10 years. Him learning how to write and me learning how to use a word program. It was like 4 years before I found the find function. So it's a little hard sometimes to get education on things when you live out here, so you have to do it yourself. So Bill, yeah, he began to write. He did little maps and he wrote goat farm here. And I would say, so Bill, when were the goats there and who put them there and what happened to them? And then I would teach him about using a period to end a sentence and organizing your thoughts. And after I yeah, got pretty comfortable with that word program, I sent the book to Harbor Publishing, and after 6 months, they sent me a little note that said, "We're interested in reading more of your book." I did know by then to send just 2 chapters. So yeah, Harper published that book, and it actually was nominated for the Bill Duthie's Bookseller's Choice Award. And what year was that? Sorry, 20, nope, 19, no, 2003. So we didn't win that award, but it was pretty thrilling. It was the first soft cover book to ever be nominated for that award, and we're both pretty proud of it. Then the second book that I did was my memoir, because it was so fresh in my mind, all of my fishing experiences with Bill, and then all of the uh, homesteading experiences I was having, the challenges of working, on the land and building with my husband and raising my children and trying to make a living as an artist. So you can imagine what kind of a life. It was very full. And I found a publisher for Drawn to Sea, which was my memoir. And there's a little play on words there. And Caitlin Press published that book. Um, the publisher of Caitlin actually had been the production manager for Howard White, and she and I struck up a good friendship. So that book came out 2013, yes, 10 years after Full Moon Flood Tide. So it's a long, long journey between books. But right around the same time, Billy and I did Tide Rips and Back Eddies, which focuses on Blackfish Sound. And his history and memories, and that targeted and found the same audience as all of our coastie books, actually. And after Tide Rips, I was sitting painting one day, and I was recovering from bilateral knee replacement surgery, and I heard them talking on the CBC about the adult coloring book craze and how therapeutic this was. Of course, all my life I have felt and believed that art and the being self-expressed is therapeutic, and probably would, if everybody painted and drew, there maybe wouldn't be war. I don't know, it's my personal crackpot theory. So I thought I can do that. My first job when I got out of college was as a film animator, assistant film animator to be precise. And I loved to draw and got paid for it. It was so amazing. And so I began to do drawings. Some were new original drawings, and some were from paintings I had already done. And I looked at some of the coloring books that were already out, and my critique was that there was no space around the drawings, around the edges, as a framer, kind of like a little space that sets things apart, and often no context. And where I live, it's full of fascinating, interesting wildlife and events and things that most people just don't get to see very often. And so I had little stories about the drawings, and then because I'm a teacher and instructor, I just can't help it. I thought, oh, I'm going to put in artist tips, and so my coloring book, um, yeah, it had artist tips and this interesting material to give people links to further find out, about the humpback whales or different things that I had included in the drawings. I sent that to Howard, to Harbor Publishing, and he replied and asked me if I could do 40 drawings by the end of February. I had sent him 14. So luckily, I didn't have too much to do because of my knees, and I produced the drawings and the text, and that book came out by June, which is kind of amazing, and was timing wise quite interestingly successful. for a number of reasons, one of which that the Vancouver Sun published 4 drawings in 4 consecutive weeks during 2020, the height of COVID. And all of this time in my mind was brewing a story, a fictionalized, just fiction, a novel, but enlivened by all the people I knew, the things I'd heard, little phrases, interactions, and I began to create my novel, Murder Rides a Gale Force Wind, set in Echo Bay. And then I had a really hard time trying to come up with a character that was more interesting than Bill. And so finally I just caved in. I said, Bill, can I just channel you in this book? And he had come up with 2 names, Back Eddie and Woody Debris, as kind of characters. And he thought someday he might write about, but he never did. And so he willingly gave them over to me. I wrote about all this, in the acknowledgments at the back of the book. So that book took me 8 years to write too. I'm clearly not a very fast writer, but yeah, that ended up self-publishing this book because you can, and because I wanted to see how it would compare as an experience to having been published by, reputable and highly successful book publishers. And Murder Rides a Gale Force Wind was quite fun to write, but I have to say a lot more difficult than any of the other books. The only thing that's really completely accurate and true is the setting, because I needed to have something that was a framework within which, the whole story could hang and be cradled, as making things up and dialogue and people and characters and actions. And whenever I got confused or derailed or a little bit stumped, I would just ground myself in the landscape again and find my path. Yeah, so Murder Rides, was very much about my community. And I really took on the challenge of navigating the issue of how people look for and find, whether you intended it or not, themselves in your novel. So that has caused some downstream, not friction per se, but things that needed to be worked out. Basically, if you're looking for yourself in my novel, you're not there, not from me anyway. So I think that's what I would offer to other writers, is to really work very hard to just be clear. It's a story. It's a story. And people see themselves in stories all the time, but honestly, that's the reader's responsibility to understand that what they see is only a reflection of themselves and not the author's intention. All of my books are still in print and available through me and bookstores and Amazon, except for Color the British Columbia Coast, which, due to supply chain issues and the increase in cost, it is currently out of print, and I'm planning to reissue it myself, which is a whole new adventure.